Okay. Hello everyone, this is the Theory into Practice group podcast, and I am Jo Kukuczka, one of the group's co-conveners. In this episode today, we will be exploring Vygotskian dynamic assessment and academic writing with our guest, Dr Prithvi Shrestha. Prithvi is Senior Lecturer in English Language at the Open University in the UK, and he is the author of Dynamic Assessment of Students' Academic Writing, Vygotskian and Systemic Functional Linguistics Perspectives. And this book was published in 2020 by Springer. And this is precisely this book that has been the inspiration behind today's podcast. And I'm really, really happy to have the opportunity to discuss the book and the ideas presented there with the author. So let's get started. So hello, Prithvi. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello, Jo. Thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this interview podcast. I'm honored to be a part of this series.
Oh, wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on. Thank you so much, Prithvi. Let's move on to my first question, but first a little bit of background maybe. So lower student satisfaction regarding assessment and feedback specifically, so assessment and feedback in higher education, especially when we compare it with other aspects of higher education academic support. So assessment and feedback in higher education has been the driver behind the research that you report on in your book. And then when investigating the issue, you drew on a Vygotsky-inspired assessment approach, and that's called dynamic assessment, in short, DEA. And then you found evidence that it may, in fact, have a positive impact on academic writing assessment practices. And that's quite important, quite interesting. And you should see my notes all over your book, actually. So when I sort of go back and think about this question. But before we get to the practical implications that you kind of were reporting on in your book, can you tell us a little bit more, since this is Theory into Practice podcast, TiP podcast, can you tell us a little bit more about the theoretical concept of dynamic assessment, please?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jo. That's a very a glowing comment on on my work. So let me begin with what exactly dynamic assessment or DA means. In simple terms, it is an assessment approach that blends or combines instruction or teaching with assessment. Basically, that's what it does. It has three assumptions, I should say. One, traditional assessment may not be suitable for all learners, so you need some alternatives. Two, assessment should consider what a learner will be able to do in the future, not just present, but their potential. Instead of focusing on their past performance, it's more about what they are capable of doing. And the third assumption is information from the assessment should be used to design teaching support or interventions, adapting them as needed. DA originated in the influential work of Lev Vygotsky, who is a Russian psychologist, pretty much very well known for his work, his theory, sociocultural theory of learning, which emphasizes on learning that is collaborative and learning takes place in this social context. And especially his book, known to the Western world in 1978, called Mind in Society, that influenced lots of work within sociocultural theory of learning in the West. Mm-hmm. So it is based on his concept or method called genetic method, which is developmental method. So it's not genetic, not biological genetic. It's more to do with the development of mind. And it's not focused on product, but on the process, the process of development, especially higher mental functions in humans or learners. There are a few key concepts that I should highlight. The most well-known one to perhaps our listeners as well is the zone of proximal development, which must be familiar or you must have come across when it is around learning or language learning, which is about the potential ability of a person or individual or learner, which can develop with the support of a more capable peer or teacher in the context of classroom. And the focus would be on, what they can do with support. So it's the potential of the learner. And the other concept central to DA is mediation, which is, as I mentioned in my book, is a process that we all humans employ in order to regulate the material world around us, the others, or their own social and mental activity, by using culturally constructed artifacts such as language, tools, like even pen, computers, and any concepts and activities we have access to. So it's a process that you control things or, interact. The third concept, which is also key to DI, is internalization. That is to do with the regulation of learning, whether it's regulated by the individual themselves or regulated by the other person who is supporting you in the process of learning. So through the process of other regulation, the individual starts taking control of the psychological or semiotic tools such as language and concepts in a discipline, for example, or it can be even everyday concepts. And they try to make their own. So that's how internalization takes place. And linked with internalization is also the concept of imitation, which is not, blind copying or, mindless copying of things, but there is a thoughtful, intentional, and selective process involved, what you copy, what you imitate. Like in the process of learning, learners do that. Of course, they will try their best to make their own, internalize, but the initial stage tends to be, more imitation rather than actually, being able to do things independently. Yeah. The other things that I want to mention about this theory is, as it is a theory of learning, it needs to be combined with, if it's in the context of language education, let's say, or academic writing, it needs to be combined with a certain theory of language as well, because you need to talk about concepts related to language. But the beauty is that it doesn't matter which theory you use. I think you can use any theory of language you subscribe to. In my case, I used systemic functional linguistics because that's the one I found the most inspiring in the context of academic writing. And finally, I'd like to mention about this theory that it very much aligns with the recent calls for equitable assessment, which promotes social justice, because DA recognizes students' needs. It's not, equal treatment of individual learners, but equitable treatment where, we consider individual needs and the resources they have. So, the recent call by Jan MacArthur, MacArthur's work, which she calls Assessment for Social Justice, that she published in 2018. So I see a lot of, connection there. Thank you. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, thank you so much. This is really fantastic, sort of in a nutshell, almost explanation or introduction to this theory of dynamic assessment. And I love I really love how you very clearly showed us the links, how it links to almost context around it, how it can be used. It's really versatile. So yes, we talk about academic writing today, and we talk about English language potentially, or language, but I think it's important, and you have shown this really clearly, how you can apply it to many different contexts, basically, and I think what I'm getting from it here as well is, this link, very important link that you highlighted right at the end. So the link to the equity of assessment. So when we have conversations around inclusion, exclusion, equity, equality, this is something potentially, to dip into and perhaps learn more about in that context, especially, set aside academic writing, which is also a very important part of this, obviously. But this is how I'm seeing, this episode can be very relevant to colleagues, thinking around those themes as well as what we are talking about. Thank you. Wonderful. Okay. So what I'm going to do is to move on to my next question. And final for today. So we talked about theory and the context around it, and potentially you already started drawing on how it can be maybe used and acted. But so my second question is more about the practice. So how can DA work in practice? Yes, I am talking particularly in relation to academic writing, assessment and feedback, because that's the focus in your book. But you can also, on top of that, draw on maybe any other examples, any other practices that can be enacting this theory for us in the broader field of teaching and learning in higher education. That would be wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think what's the point of theory if you can't, practically use it?
Absolutely.
And I think which goes in line with what Vygotsky said as well. Dynamic assessment had been predominantly used in second and foreign language education, particularly after the seminal publication by Jim Lantoff and Matt Poyner in 2004. Before that, I think it was used mainly in the clinical context, in clinical psychology. And as far as I am aware, it's not been used widely, or perhaps only a handful of publications in the context of academic writing or disciplinary writing. As I mentioned, it's DA is about blending teaching and assessment, so it can be applied to any context in the in higher education or school education, doesn't matter. And because it focuses on process, so it's very well suited to process-based writing or process writing, which is also a established field within writing studies or academic writing. So basically, the process, how it works, is in the context of writing. So the learner first produces an independently constructed text in response to a particular writing brief, whatever that brief may be, and then that is seen or read by the teacher, and in the process of reading they provide developmental feedback, right? They comment, and the process of commenting can be dependent on what is available. For example, it can be like just using the Microsoft comment function, or it may be online like Google Docs, which can happen asynchronously, or it can be you may have broad comments on the text and then have verbal face-to-face interaction with the learner. But there are certain principles that DA practitioner has to adhere to. That is, you don't give them a direct answer to any issues or problems noticed in the writing, but it's more like probing, questions, prompts, cues.
Why is that?
That is because the focus is not what they already know, but what is potential. how much you can push them towards their, potential ability in terms of their writing or academic writing. So it's very dialogic. If it's text-based interaction, then there will be many iterations of the draft text until both the learner and the teacher are happy. But in that case, it doesn't mean it goes on and on forever. It has to be stopped somewhere, then move on to something or a new task where the student can perform perhaps more independently with maybe little or no support from the learner. And the focus is not on superficial things like spelling or, very obvious grammar mistakes. It's more about their conceptual knowledge, because we're talking about disciplinary writing. There may be concepts drawn, for example, in the context of business management education, let's say, because I researched that, so I'm taking that as an example. The student is asked to, write a discussion text or essay, let's say, based on some case studies presented to them. And so here, about globalization, let's say. So they're asked to use the concept globalization to examine a particular business, and also the drivers of globalization, where they need to use those concepts to analyze the company or business. So in that case, it's not just the writing. It's also about the conceptual knowledge development. So here, the job of the teacher is not just looking at writing as such, but also their conceptual knowledge development, whether they have used the concepts correctly or not. And so the teacher's role is to gradually, if the learner is not responding well, just by giving prompts and cues, you start making your questions or prompts more explicit, towards perhaps the correct answer. So it moves from implicit to explicit support. Right. And then when, you feel, or the learner feels capable of doing with only cues, then so they have learned and they have internalized what they have learned in the process, and so they can perform or write a similar text independently without having much support from the teacher or tutor, whatever they're called. And I think in the context of academic writing, genre knowledge is an important aspect, which you can do the same. I mean, you can apply the same technique. How the moves, when you write a particular text, depending on how, it is taught, of course, in the course. So you can always refer back to what, approach has been taken, because there are different ways of teaching different genres, whether, systemic functional linguistic approach or more, moves analysis approach, like by Swells and so on, or more academic literacies approach. So I think you can take any, as I said, with DA. And the basic principle is make it dialogic, interactional, rather than, just giving them answers. Because our focus is on the future, the potential of the learner. And also, it's very individualized. That means every learner is different. And their circumstances are different. And that's how you treat them differently according to their needs. I think basically that's what it is in terms of the practice. And of course, there are examples in my book as well, how that's been done. And people have used, I think, Google Doc. Also, I used chats, instant chats, to interact with the learner. There are different methods you can use. And of course, face-to-face, which is also effective. And most of the work has been around that. But increasingly now, computer-mediated communication is used to, interact with the learner. And so I think the prompts are graduated, as I said, beginning with a very implicit and moving towards more explicit if the response is not desirable, if the desirable response isn't coming from the learner.
Wow, it's fascinating, and I think what I find particularly beautiful about it is that obviously in your book you've got evidence. The research has been done. You've got the evidence that actually it has got a positive impact. This approach has got positive impact on academic writing assessment practices. What I really so this is one thing, kind of proving the point almost. On another hand, is thinking how you told us about the theory first, and you did talk about potential, but I think now I'm getting it more, once you've gone into the practice and the practical, you basically walked us through step by step how it can be approached. And then you went back to because it is about process, because it is about potential, the future, this diverse learner, the needs of that learner. And again, that brings back the argument of this, this link to equity of assessment. And again, really, really, the conversations that we are having right now across the teaching and learning in higher education, which is wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, I hope we can maybe extend it in future at some point. For now, it's a wonderful introduction to the theory, and then how can be enacted in practice in a meaningful way. Thank you for very, very specific examples. So actually we can listen to it and now apply it and think, oh, maybe I've already been doing it, and now I've got the theory to put behind it or underpin with it. Now I know why things work better or not for my students. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Prithvi, for making the time and coming to see us today. And hopefully hoping to see more work coming out of your research very soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation once again. And I hope the listeners will find some of the ideas applicable to their context. And of course, the book provides further examples of how the theory can be enacted in practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much.